Chapter 4. Whatever we desire and do, our heart is restless, inquietum, until it rests in you. Requiescat in te, Augustine wrote, addressing God at the beginning of his Confessions. This eloquent suggestion that our inner life is marked by an experience of unrest or anxiety, revealing a deep desire for being in God, is not in itself distinctively Christian. It captures rather well Spinoza's view of the human condition, which likewise involves the diagnosis of the soul's unrest, animi commotionis and animi fluxionis, and proposes a resting place, animi acquiescentia, constituted by being in God. In the appendix to part 4 of the Ethics, Spinoza offers one of his clearest summaries of the ethical task he sets before his readers. It is therefore of the first importance in life to perfect our intellect or reason as far as possible. If this one thing consists man's highest happiness or blessedness, felicitas seu beatitudo, for blessedness is nothing else than a peace of mind, animi acquiescentia, which springs from the intuitive knowledge of God, and to perfect the intellect is nothing else than to understand God, the attributes and actions of God which follow from the necessity of God's nature. So the ultimate aim, finis ultimus, of the man who is led by reason, i.e. his highest desire, summa cupiditas, by which he endeavors to that to govern all other desires, is that which leads to the adequate knowledge of himself and of all objects which can be embraced by his understanding, intelligentsia. Readers may be surprised to find Spinoza writing in this way of our aims, desires, and endeavors. By this point in the text, he has criticized theological thinking and denied human beings any free will. Don't we need some conception of freedom and of theology, teleology, in order to believe that there is a good way to live and that human beings desire and strive for this good? Human desire is both ontologically and ethically crucial for Spinoza. In this chapter, we shall see that our desires are, so to speak, the feeling of being, the feeling of being human, the feeling of being alive, the feeling of being in God. Desire is also a motive for action or agency and the foundation of our emotional life. It is not surprising then that desire forms the basis of Spinoza's religion. The final superposition in ethics affirms that the good which everyone who seeks virtue wants for himself, he also desires for other people, and this desire is greater as his knowledge of God is greater. In the scholium to this proposition, religion is defined as whatever we desire and do, quid cupimus et agimus, insofar as we have the idea of God as cause or insofar as we know God. And when in part 5 Spinoza asserts that the mind's highest striving, summus mentis conatus, and its highest virtue is to know intuitively both God and similar things, he follows this with two propositions which associate this knowledge first with desire and then with rest. The more capable the mind is of knowing things by the third kind of cognition, the more it desires Cupid to know things. From this kind of cognition there arises the highest possible repose of mind, mentis acquiescentia auritur. So if you want to understand Spinoza's account of our highest good, and thus of our ethical or religious task, you must attend to the way he understands desire and action. In the background to Spinoza's distinctive conception of human striving is the formalized teleological thinking of medieval and early modern theology. This was shaped by Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scholars' propositions of Aristotle's fourfold analysis of causation, which distinguished between efficient, material, formal, and final causes. Well, Aristotle developed this account to explain how things come to be by natural processes and by human craft. Theologians such as Moses, Maimonides, and Thomas Aquinas adopted his concepts to divine agency. God was said to be the efficient, formal, and final cause of creation, but emphatically not the material cause, since God was not a material being who created the universe out of himself, against the opposite heresy that God created out of pre-existing matter, as dualists like the Manichaeans had argued, arose the doctrine that God made matter ex nihilo, out of nothing. Within the Christian tradition, which directly shaped Spinoza's philosophical milieu, Aquinas emphasized a desire for God animating creation as a whole and human lives in particular, giving a cognitive gloss to Augustine's insight that human hearts are restless until they find rest in God. Aquinas wrote, "Our natural desire to know cannot be at rest in us until we know the first cause by its essence. But the first cause is God, therefore the final end of an intellectual creature is to see God essentially. Denying that God has extrinsic purposes, Aquinas ascribed to God what we might call an intrinsic or immanent teleology. Nothing apart from God is the end of God, finis Dei. Yet God himself is the end with respect to all things made by him. The object of the divine will is its own goodness, which is its essence." By the early 17th century, the medieval habitus of teleological thinking was being called into question, notably by the Jesuit philosopher Francisco Suarez, who influenced Descartes. Both thinkers prioritized efficient causation, which became the core explanatory category of the new natural philosophy, the basis of modern science. In 1620, Francis Bacon argued that the final cause rather corrupts than advances the sciences. Hobbes extended the denial of final causation to the moral realm, declaring that there is no such finis ultimus, utmost end, nor summum bonum, greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. Most 17th century thinkers did not go so far as Hobbes, however, and this distinctively modern shift away from teleological explanation was usually restrained by the demands of Christian orthodoxy. Descartes emphasized efficient causation while equivocating on the question of God's teleological agency. He certainly did not deny outright that God has purposes. In the Meditations, he writes rather craftily that God is capable of countless things whose causes are beyond my knowledge, and for this reason alone I consider the customary search for final causes to be totally useless in physics. There is considerable rashness in thinking myself capable of investigating the purposes of God. In the domain of ethics, meanwhile, Descartes was happy to attribute teleological agency to human beings. Writing to Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in 1645, he explained that virtue and happiness, la beatitude, are our supreme, good and final end. And in a 1647 letter to Queen Christina of Sweden, he declared that the will's firm and constant resolution to carry out to the letter all the things one judges to be best by itself constitutes all the virtues. This alone produces the greatest and most solid contentment in life. Here, Descartes describes free will as the noblest thing we can have, since it makes us in a way equal to God and seems to exempt us from being God's subjects. He insists that the right exercise of our free will is the greatest of all the goods we can possess. Nothing but free will can produce our greatest happiness. There is a slight hint here of the intrinsic or immanent theology that Aquinas attributed to God. Descartes is suggesting that our highest good lies within ourselves, in the quality of our own willing rather than in anything external to us. Peace of mind and inner satisfaction felt by those who know they always do their best to discover what is good and to acquire it is, we see, a pleasure incomparable sweeter, more lasting and more solid than all those which come from elsewhere, he advised Queen Christina. The question of God's purposes is a different issue, of course, from our own teleological orientation, whether towards God or towards our own happiness. Nevertheless, these issues easily become confused when God is conceived anthropomorphically, so that human purposes are ascribed to divine activity. In the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza continues the early modern critique of teleological thinking about natural processes, stating more decisively than Descartes that nature has no pre-established end and that all final causes are nothing more than human fictions. Like Descartes, though he seems to allow for teleological human action and warns his readers against projecting their own motivations onto the natural world. All the prejudices which I here undertake to show depend on this, namely, that people commonly suppose all natural things to act as they themselves do, for the sake of an end, and even regard it as certain that God himself directs everything to a particular end, for they may say that God made everything for the sake of man, and man that he might worship God. Attributing final causes to both God and nature gives rise, Spinoza argues, to prejudices concerning good and evil, merit and sin, praise and blame, order and confusion, beauty and deformity. In other words, to the whole assemblage of concepts that governed conventional moral thinking in the 17th century and still shape moral life today. Perhaps surprisingly, Spinoza's attitude towards divine purposes seems closer to Aquinas than to Descartes. Instead of espousing Descartes' skeptical claim that we cannot know the purposes of God, he echoes Aquinas in asserting that God simply cannot have extrinsic purposes. As Aquinas put it, nothing apart from God is the end of God, finis Dei. In part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza criticizes the opinion that God produces all things according to the rule of the good, and grounds that this seems to posit something outside God, which does not depend on God, to which God attends as a model in what he does, and at what he aims as at a certain goal. This is simply to subject God to fate. In the preface to part 4, he seems to go further, suggesting that the very notion of divine purpose is incoherent. As God exists for the sake of no end, he acts for the sake of no end. His action as well as his existence has no ground of commencement, and no end which is related to it as a motive.